I don't think that anybody who has listened to me or read what I've written over the course of the last 10 or 15 years would be surprised to say that Thomas Chalmers, great 19th century Scottish theologian and educator and pastor and philosopher, publisher, educator, I don't think anybody would be surprised if they heard me say he's been a huge influence, if not the formative influence on my thinking. I actually first became acquainted with Thomas Chalmers through a sermon that I read in the days leading up to when I went off to seminary. I was still in college, and I ran across this sermon. It's entitled "The Expulsive Power of a New Affection." I read it in an anthology of great sermons, and was powerfully affected by it, by its vision of grace. But I didn't know a thing about Chalmers. I probably in church history class in seminary learned what would be the equivalent of, say, a paragraph about his life and work, and a few sketches about the Free Church of Scotland, but basically that was all. Until about 20 years ago, I was out on the speaking circuit. I was on the West Coast, and I was being introduced to speak at this conference, and this person introducing me said that George Grant is the closest thing that we have in this generation to Thomas Chalmers. And I took that to be a compliment, but I didn't know what kind of compliment it was. I've since found out that I am by no means the equivalent of a Thomas Chalmers, but that sparked my interest, and I began to search. In fact, that very day, we went off to a little antiquarian bookshop there in Eugene, Oregon, and I actually bought and began to peruse a copy of perhaps his most famous and best-selling book, which is entitled The Astronomical Discourses, which was a series of talks that he gave on a weekday at lunchtime to the people, mostly businessmen of Glasgow, on the subject of astronomy, but from a Christian worldview perspective. And the whole point of it was apologetics. What I love about Chalmers is that he was able to wed a great intellectual precociousness. He was interested in everything, from economics and politics across the board to the arts and sciences. He was a lover of the church and of churchmen. He loved the whole tug of war that is church politics, and yet he was never disillusioned and was vibrant with the hope of the gospel in everything that he said and did. He really broke the mold. And in the Astronomical Discourses, he really displays all of that. It's beautiful language, soaring intellect, wrestling with all of the big scientific questions of his time, but from a thoroughgoing Christian perspective with an evangelistic intent. And that's just incredibly attractive to me, and I think shows a pattern that is very transferable to our own time. He was a great reader, a lifelong learner, ultimately the consummate educator, the founder of innumerable schools, planter of innumerable church plants, and even the father of an entire denomination. One of my favorite books is one of the rarest books that I have in my collection of Chalmers. I've been collecting him throughout the last 15 or 20 years. Is a book entitled Commercial Affairs that he wrote in 1820, in which he just lays out a plan for a kind of economic recovery for Scotland, rooted in both free market principles and the generosity of those that God entrusts with wealth. He had a great heart for the poor. He was a great visionary for missions, and saw the production of wealth as the means by which the gospel could spread to the ends of the earth. He was also, because he was a great churchman, he was also a man who preached great sermons. I've got a collection of his sermons and these wonderful old leather-bound volumes. And though the language is quite antiquated, and it's colloquial Scots, so it's sort of doubly difficult to read. You can get a sense of why it was his audiences were captivated. Why, as Charles Haddon Spurgeon would say in The Next Generation, he was perhaps the greatest single exponent of the gospel since the time of the Apostle Paul. Amazingly, Chalmers is practically forgotten in our day. My library contains volumes like this, bound in leather that I've collected over the years. Most of the time when I go to antiquarian shops, if they do have a Chalmers volume and they know what it is, they charge astronomical sums. And my rule of thumb early on, sort of the pledge that I made with my wife, was that I would never spend more than $30 for a single volume of Chalmers. And thankfully, I've been able to collect Chalmers through the years from all over the world. And it's the only way to read Chalmers because there's virtually none of his work in print. I want to change that, but Ian Murray has a wonderful chapter on Chalmers in his book, Scottish Christian Heritage. It's a great volume and very, very helpful. There are a couple of reprints that are out there. His commentary on the book of Romans is available, although it's an expensive academic reprint. Some of his Sabbath readings are available, which are just reflections on the scriptures, which he never actually completed, but I find them wonderful to read as devotional reading. And then we have actually reprinted the Explosive Power of a New Affection, the great sermon of his. If anybody ever wonders what the emphasis on parish is and where that comes from in my reading and writing, it all really is just stolen from Chalmers. There is no modern day equivalent of a Thomas Chalmers, but hopefully one or another of my students will be.